Don't.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alyssa Ayres, and I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at the George Washington University. Welcome to this evening's discussion, which will pay particular attention to the role of religion in the recent U.S. election. Now, our focus tonight is on the United States, but we remain deeply aware of the central role played by religious identity and faith practices in politics the world over. From the close association of the Russian Orthodox Church and Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia, to the growing importance of charismatic Christianity in Latin America and Africa, we note the central role played by faith communities in the normative ordering of society. This evening's conversation is the first part of a two-day conference organized jointly by GW and Georgetown University. At GW, the Elliott School's Illiberal Studies Program, led by Professor Marlène Laruelle, who is right here in the front row, and the School of Media and Public Affairs, Professor Stephen Livingston, here worked also in the front row. They've worked closely with Georgetown University's Center on Faith and Justice, led by Jim Wallace, the inaugural holder of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair in Faith and Justice at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Now, tomorrow, leading experts from around the United States, Canada, and Europe will meet at Georgetown to participate in a series of panel discussions that will continue this evening's discussion. Tonight, our panel of distinguished experts on race, religion, and American politics will help us understand the role of religion in the 2024 U.S. elections. The discussion will be led by Michelle Martin. Michelle is a host of NPR's flagship morning news program, Morning Edition. I'm sure you all know her voice. Previously,
It's okay.
Previously, she was the weekend host of All Things Considered. Since 2018, Martin has also been a correspondent for WNET's Amanpour and Company. She's also been a reporter at the Washington Post and the White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. A Brooklyn native, Michelle graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College of Harvard University, and in 2016 earned a Master of Arts from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. I now hand things over to Michelle.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all for coming. There are a lot of good holiday movies on Hallmark, so I'm super glad to see all of you, so thank you for taking the time. Look, however you feel about the results of this year's elections, and trust me, I know there are a lot of feelings because I hear all of them every day. I'm sure we can all agree that there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to talk about because, certain ideas and groups have asserted themselves in the public square in ways that some people may not have seen before, or they may not be familiar with, or which became relevant in new ways. So we're going to talk today about one of these groups loosely defined as conservative Christians. And let me say at the outset that the purpose of this conversation is not to demean or denigrate or criticize any particular group's participation in the public square. Can we agree on that? But what we do want to talk about is what does this group of people loosely define? And we're going to help you figure out what we're talking about here, because I'm going to go to you on that. But what do they want? What do they hope for? What goals do they have? And how do other groups interact with those goals in what we all have considered to be a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy? What's the way forward here? So we're going to try to get to as many of these things as possible. We do invite you to participate at some point. We will have mic runners on both sides of the auditorium, so this is not a fitness contest. I will call on questions at some point, and if I start feeling like you really want to jump in, I will look for that. But we are also going to save some time at the end for our panel to give us some closing thoughts, because I know that you want to hear from all of them. And in fact, any one of the people on this stage could have had an entire hour's conversation with each of you. So we are very fortunate to have all of them here together, which is a very rare event. So we're going to hear from this distinguished panel because they come from a variety of skill sets and backgrounds and expertise. I'll start over here. Kristin Kobes-Dumais. She's a professor at the University of Notre Dame. You might know her from her attention-getting book, Jesus and John Wayne. Next to her is Jim Wallace. He's a professor at Georgetown. He's the author of multiple New York Times best-selling books. Now, you might know him from the Bipartisan Faith Forum he put together, where scholars, during 2008, where scholars in religiously committed persons from multiple backgrounds got to question the candidates about how they saw the intersection of faith and politics. Next to him, we have Andrew Thompson, who's assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, and his recent work focuses on the causal role of racial threat and the democratic erosion within the American public. And I'm sure that that's something that some of you here, I'm guessing, might be thinking about. Next to me here is Samuel Perry, who's professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. He is one of the world's leading authorities on religion and politics. Next to him is, EJ. Hi. EJ, hi. EJ wears many hats, but you may know him best as a columnist for the Washington Post, or as a professor at Georgetown, or as a scholar at Brookings, and all those things. And next to him, Robert P. Jones, president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, which many of us in the media, and I'm sure as scholars, rely on for fact-based insights into something which is emotionally fraught. Let's just face it, it's emotionally fraught as religion. So thank you for your work. Thank all of you for your work. So with that being said, let me start with, can we just set the table here? And Professor Dumais, I'm going to start with you. It's, when we talk about conservative Christians, who are we talking about? And I'm asking it this way because I'm just saying from my own experience, I'll just say it, a lot of Black people that I know consider themselves conservative. If you'd say, well, what are you? You'd say, oh, I'm conservative. But that doesn't mean they want to tell other people what to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they vote in ways that would dictate other people's behavior, right? So when we talk about, for purposes of this discussion, conservative Christians, who are we talking about?
I mean, I love that starting point because it problematizes the word conservative, which I think we very much need to do in a religious context or otherwise. And so if you're looking at American religious history, conservative Christians have used that label to kind of brand themselves in a particular way, even as the substance of precisely what it is that they are conserving and exactly what it means to be a Christian devotionally and in public life can actually change quite dramatically over time. So obviously when we use that term and throw it around conservative Christians, generally we are referring to the Christian right. And that includes conservative Catholics, conservative Protestants, and sometimes Mormons are included in that as well. But the most dominant group there is conservative evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals in particular. And you're right to talk about, if we look at African Americans, many would identify as devout Christians. In fact, when we look at certain Christian nationalism scales, this can kind of throw people off because a lot of Black Protestants will say, yes, this ought to be a Christian nation. But then when you get one layer below and say, well, what do you mean by that? Then you see this great divergence in terms of, in the Black Protestant tradition, it's more about pursuing equity and opening up democracy, expanding democracy, whereas in conservative white evangelical spaces, it tends to have a very different flavor in terms of both the issues and in terms of defining kind of real Americans according to a particular political agenda versus other Americans who can even be perceived as a threat.
Okay, Robert Joseph, I'm going to go to you. Do you want to add to that? And can we put some numbers on this when we talk about, like, how many people are we talking about? And have those numbers changed in recent years? Because we've also talked about the sort of the secularization of America, or the rise of the nuns, and by which I mean N-O-N-E-S, I don't mean N-U-N, I mean the nuns. So can you put some numbers on the group that we're talking about?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that, and thanks, Kristin. So one of the more remarkable sea changes in the American religious landscape has occurred in the last, say, 30 years. And we have gone from this majority calling, so we talked about kind of the white married to Christian here. And if you think about that, that's an important way of thinking about who saw themselves as the majority of Americans. A kind of like, and most time when people say this is a Christian country, what they mean is it's a white Christian country. And so we look at those numbers just to give you a sense of it. As recently as 2008, the country was a majority white Christian country. That is, if we take all white, non-Hispanic people who identify as Christian, put them all together, Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, they were 54% of the country when Barack Obama was first running for president in 2008. Just by the time he gets out of office, that number had gone from 54% to 47%. So during our first African-American president's tenure, we had the sea change in the country from being a majority white Christian country, one that was no longer majority white Christian country. Today, that number is 41, right? So it's continued to drop. And one of the things we've seen here is, by the way, it's across all groups. So it's not just one white Christian subgroup, it's all of them. So white Catholics have dropped, white mainline Protestants or non-evangelical Protestants have dropped, but there's no group that has dropped steeper than white evangelical Protestants. Now, it's going to come to a shock, I think, to many people because they're loud and very visible, particularly in the MAGA movement and in Trump's coalition. But they, in fact, today make up only 14% of the country, down from about a quarter only 20 years ago. However, here's the caveat. If you're looking at the exit polls, they're only 14% of voters, but they're about 14% of the public, but they turn out and vote at very high numbers. They were almost 1 in 5 voters in the last election.
So then let's talk about the conservative Christian vote in the 2024 election, and I'm also interested, I want to hear from this side of the aisle on this. I don't know why we put you on the left. I don't know what that means. But I want to hear from you about what do we know about the conservative Christian vote in 2024. And also I'm curious if there were any surprises, maybe.
I'll just give it real quick.
Why don't you start, and then EJ and Professor Perry, you'll pick up.
So just so everybody knows, we're here in educational institutions. It's important to know that there are 2 official exit polls floating around out there, not just one. We used to only have one. We now have 2. There's the Edison National Election Pool exit poll. That's the one that sort of New York Times and NBC and others use. And then there is the AP Votecast poll, which is a separate one. And they largely line up, but there's so essentially the picture they're giving us is that not a lot has changed. Every time Trump has been on the ballot, we basically see the same alignment in the religious landscape. It goes like this. White Christian groups, all of them, voted majority for Trump every time he's been on the ballot. So everybody knows the white evangelical number, 81%, right, of white evangelicals voted for Trump. They're right on the nose again, no movement at all. The numbers that people aren't so aware of is that white Catholics tend to vote about 6 in 10 for Trump in all those elections, and the white non-evangelical Protestant, otherwise known as the mainline, also tend to vote about 6 in 10 for Trump. Other religious groups, those are non-white Christians, tend to vote the other way, whether it's for Biden or for Harris, about 6 in 10 the other way. And then stronger groups like Jews, the religiously unaffiliated, other non-Christian religious groups tend to vote like 7 in 10 or more for Democratic candidates. But it's a stark divide between kind of white Christians, and I guess the one other group I should mention are Latino Protestants. That group tends to vote Republican as well at about the 6 in 10 level. Latino Catholics tend to vote the other way, right? So there's this kind of big divide in the Latino community between Protestants that tend to be more evangelical and Catholics.
Just before we move on to EJ and Professor Perry, I wanted to ask, did we see any change there? Because we've all been hearing about the move among
not a lot of
groups.
movement. The one place where it's unclear, I would say, is that there's a discrepancy in the 2 exit polls about Latino Catholics. So the Edison NEP poll has Latino Catholics at 52% support for Trump. We've never seen that in any pre-election data that EJ and I did at PRI and Brookings, or in any exit poll. So that would, in fact, be quite seismic change if that happened. But the AP Votecast poll has them at 4 in 10. Support for Trump. So we've got this kind of 12-point discrepancy among Latino Catholics. That's not that surprising because the methodologies are challenging for exit polls, and particularly with subgroups, they're a real challenge. So the further down you go, and we also have language issues and sampling with Latinos that can add to the kind of challenges there. So I think we're going to have to wait until we get some more data to really know where Latino Catholics were. But my hunch is that the AP number around 4 in 10 is probably closer to right.
And there's also cultural things. Like I know when I've been canvassing, some people just don't want you in their business. Right. Yeah. I mean, some people just were like, why do you need to know? So it's kind of, speaking of methodology. So that's the layperson's way of talking about methodology, which is, I don't need you in my business. So, EJ, what did you notice?
Well, I think first of all, it's great to be here with this incredible group of people, and Michelle, who's I've admired for so long, and she gets up at 2:30 in the morning to wake me up hours later. So thank you.
Not just you.
Very
just
much that. It wasn't just me. I always thought it was just me. Thank you.
Just wanted to clarify for anybody who was
concerned.
Thank
you so much. There are a couple of things I want to say, one about change, one about not change. There is, when it comes to the Catholic vote, my favorite story is about Mrs. O'Reilly being taken to the polls by her son. Her son now is well-to-do. He votes for a lot of Republicans, but his mom still always votes Democratic. One day he asks her, as usual, he takes her to the polls, "How are you going to vote, Mom?" She says, "Straight Democratic." And the son says, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you'd vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly says, "Oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years?" And I think one of the things you're seeing is a lot of people think he has changed his party after all these years. On the one hand, on the evangelical side, there really has been very little movement. We make a lot of the white evangelical vote as the core of Trump's base. And it's very important. It wasn't, by the way, at the beginning of his career. When he started out, evangelicals were very skeptical. They helped Ted Cruz beat Trump in the Iowa caucuses back in 2016. But over time, this bond was created with Trump seen as some evangelical preachers saw it as Cyrus of Persia, protecting the evangelical community. Even though he might not fully be one of us, he's protecting us from those liberals, from those secularists. But the support of white evangelicals for Republicans goes way back, and you can see those numbers being essentially the same for George W. Bush in both elections, for Mitt Romney, and even back further. So I think it's very important to bear that in mind. This is not a new phenomenon. Among white Catholics is a change, as Mrs. O'Reilly suggests. White Catholics have drifted more Republican over a long period of time. There was always more swing in the Catholic community than people thought. They were seen as arch Democrats. But in this election, among white Catholics, there was a really, it really was quite decisive for Trump. The 61%, which I think is in both, more or less in both, 61%. That is a significant drift to the right. In that group. One other group I want to put on the table, because it may include a lot of you, and while it doesn't directly relate to this conversation, it does in other ways. Probably the most important religious group, most important sociological change in our country is the rise of the nuns. As Robbie mentioned, or as you mentioned, Michelle, N-O-N-E-S, people who do not identify with a religious tradition when they're asked the question by survey givers. And the nuns loom very large in your generation. 69% of the religious nuns are under 50, and 38%, these are 2022 numbers, of Americans under 30 are religiously unaffiliated. And I think that has actually increased the polarization in the conversation in our country over religion. And some of the religious nuns were created by the religious right. They were people who were progressive, who decided that if that's what religion is, that's not me. But it is also the case that I think it's it's taking young people out of more progressive religious congregations. Young people who might have either been more progressive Catholics or have been part of churches that were more on the progressive side. Again, this is mostly white, have been left out. And then finally, the black vote, Protestant or none, or about 10% of blacks are Catholic, is still overwhelmingly Democratic. And I think the contrast between the black church and the white evangelical church is a fascinating thing that we might get into as we go.
Mm-hmm. Professor Perry, what about you? What did you notice? Anything surprise you? What would you want to pull out for this conversation?
Sure. I think what we saw in this election is really a continuation of some trends that have been going on for a long, long time. And so you won't understand the situation we face in American politics and religion's role in that, and pretty obviously race's role in that, in the changes that we saw, unless you understand partisan sorting. So what's been taking place over the last few decades is that Americans are increasingly sorting their really relevant social identities underneath their partisan and ideological identities. And especially white Americans have been doing this for a long, long time. For black and Hispanic Americans, you can have a situation where you have a lot of moderates and conservatives who vote Democrat, right? And that's no longer the case as much anymore. Black Americans and Latino Americans are now starting to ideologically sort into parties, just like white Americans have. And so the shifts that we see, and what took place in, say, religious vote, yet again, we see 81% of white evangelicals voting for Trump, no matter what he says or does or anything. And that's one piece of evidence that really, for white evangelicals, anything religious is now downstream of their politics. It is decided largely by the ideological and political tribe that they belong to, and whoever is representing them. It's going to be, we're all for that person. And so no matter who they appoint, no matter what they do, no matter what they say. And so we rack our brains trying to understand how could they possibly say one thing and support a person like that. We've been doing that for 8 years now, and it really doesn't make sense unless you recognize that, like, no, really politics is driving all of this, and theological language is the justification after the fact, right? Like anybody who knows the history of race and religion in the United States knows that theology can be marshaled and trotted out to justify just about any kind of thing that my ideological or ethno-racial tribe needs in that particular moment. We see that with white evangelicals. I think the fascinating development in this particular election, as we saw a little bit of shift among Hispanic Americans and Black Americans, is that they are sorting into parties to follow their ideological commitments. So previously you might have had, like you were referencing, you have Black Americans or Hispanic Americans who could be conservative, but they consistently vote Democrat. Now they are becoming more like white Americans in that if they're conservative, they vote Republican, and if they're liberal, they vote Democrat.
And when did that start? Because I'm so fascinated by this, because I've heard so many different theories, and Andrew, I want to ask you to weigh in on this if you would like, or rather, Professor Thompson, excuse me.
okay.
I want to acknowledge your earned expertise. But I want to get you, but I have one question for you is, when did this start? Because some people would say, well, it started, how did this start so soon after Barack Obama was president? And some people said, well, Barack Obama was an anomaly, that even people who saw themselves as conservative could not resist, wanted to vote for him because it was him, the opportunity to vote for this historic figure, even though his political philosophy may have differed from theirs. But other people, so I'm asking you, when did that sorting start?
Oh, the sorting has been taking place for the last 40 or so years. So in the 1970s, you were just as likely to be an evangelical Democrat as an evangelical Republican. Now that's obviously not the case because those groups, religious nuns or the unaffiliated, conservative white Americans have really sorted really cleanly into those particular partisan tribes. The racial story, I think, is something that has taken place more recently. And with Hispanic Americans, you see it after a few generations. So Latinos or Hispanic Americans coming to the United States, and they closer to being foreign-born or immigration status, they're more likely to vote Democrat, more likely to be Roman Catholic. But after a few generations, and the growing percentage of Hispanics in the United States are native to the United States and have been here longer. And as they stay longer, they just become more like white Americans in their ideological and religious leanings and their sorting in that pattern. And so what we're witnessing with Hispanic Americans is a continuation of a slow trend that has taken place over a longer period of time, to where they end up just being more like white Christian Republicans.
Could I jump in? Because I just think it's important. We're making a lot, and it is important about Latinos in this election. But Latinos have not always been solid Democrats. George W. Bush got 40 to 45%, depending on the election, 37 to 45% of the Latino vote, with particular strength among evangelical Latinos who voted for George W. Bush. By about the same margin, they voted for Trump. There was a collapse in the Latino vote for Republicans after fights over immigration. And so it declined. Now it's back up again. So it's not entirely new, and it shows the complexity. Latino refers to a lot of very different kinds of people. On the black vote, again, you still saw an overwhelmingly Democratic black vote for Harris. Sure. And that it was mostly a decline among some younger black voters, particularly black men. And even in that group, they were still quite strongly Democratic. So I think it's important. What's happening among blacks and Latinos is equated. There is some overlap, but I think there are a couple of different things are going on in those.
I know it's true, because let me bring the other side of the panel. We haven't forgotten about Professor Thompson. What did you notice? What did you want to bring forth about what you noticed in these?
Yeah, I have a two fingers to series of comments on here. So, I mean, yes, first, EJ, I absolutely agree with the point that you're raising, that So we not only have, like, when we think of like Latino Americans, this sort of large heterogeneous group of people who are like sort of labeled as a single cohesive body, but as we have known for, since even defining the group, are going to function.
Texas became a state.
There's not this like ethos or just like central brain of any particular group that's going to like motivate people to just like turn in one direction of a party. So we need to obviously, this is where like people talk about nuance and things of that nature. I think the one thing I want to add that's kind of like in a summary of everything that we've been discussing up here is the question of what comes next. Everybody wants to be sort of the first when it comes to like making inferences and sort of assertions about what it is that we've seen and what this tells us about the future. The fact of the matter is we can explain right now and we don't know what the future looks like. These may be some degree of indicators, but like this is not at all, we are not on a set sort of deterministic path where this is an election that is then setting forth what things look like into the future. I'll give you an example of exactly what this is. The GOP 2012 autopsy. After Obama won after he won his second term, was reelected, the GOP as a party scrambled and was basically talking about how there was this diverse young coalition of people who the Democratic Party had built that was sort of slated to win into the future in ways that would like completely advantage the Democratic Party over the Republican Party into from time immemorial into the future. And that's obviously not what happened. So I want to throw cold water in this case on like any sort of assertions about how we think things might be looking and going.
So who was fluid in that case? But who was fluid in that case? Because I totally remember that autopsy. It was headed by Ed Gillespie, who was the chief of staff in the Bush White House, the second Bush administration. He was an RNC chair. He ran for governor unsuccessfully. And partly because of that experience, he was like, hold up. The party is getting older, whiter, more conservative. You can't grow that way. We got to figure out how to grow.
I can't.
So where's the swing in that? Who's switching? Who's moving?
I can't explain. I mean, there's a series of groups. Like it's not one or any. And there's not an immediate clear answer to that. I think really importantly, in terms of there being a reaction, and I think this is where the sort of idea not only of sort of like white Christian nationalism comes in, a direct reaction to Obama, or just this idea of a diversifying country. We see there being a kind of groundswell of like direct opposition that then mobilizes some people who had not been a part of sort of formal politics into 2016, and then the kind of like ascendance, rise of Trumpism, kind of in tandem with the emergence of the Tea Party around about 2010 moving forward. But the last thing I want to sort of add in on this, and I think this comes to the question of sorting, and like is when we talk about, in this case, religion and politics, really importantly as it relates to sorting and identity and variant other sort of identity groups, the fact that like religion and religiosity of individuals can predict their party identification amidst a series of their sort of social forms of identity in stronger ways, which is exactly what this idea of sorting is. Stronger ways now than they have previously. When we think about loss, particularly, which we had been talking about leading up to this election, what things look like when it comes to party loss, we are not only talking about party loss, we're talking about sort of threats directly to people's forms of identity and existence in such a way where I think asking the question about what comes next, it really begs the question of to what lengths are people willing to go to protect their identity if in fact they feel it's threatened.
So that is a perfect segue to where I wanted to go next, because I wanted to ask about Christian nationalism. Like, what are we talking about? Because we've been talking about conservative Christians so far, big tent, and we've already discussed the fact that maybe people identify as conservative or as a conservative Christian. That doesn't necessarily, for some people, that's not necessarily determinative. When we talk about Christian nationalism, what are we talking about? Jim Wallace, do you want to start with that? And Kristin, I'm going to ask you to jump in.
What a great panel. Thank you all. And thank you all for coming out. I know a lot of you probably are looking for pastoral care still.
Jim is good at that. You should call him up.
I hope this is helpful with that. I think that's the right question, because all the reasons that I thought you had a great listing and analysis of reasons why. One reason is there's a whole lot of economic anger and frustration. E.J.'s town went Republican for the first time in 100 years, right? And you had people telling people who are suffering from inflation, the economy's good, don't worry about inflation, coming from people who don't worry about inflation in their own lives. So there's a whole disconnect there. So economic anger, Jim Carville. But I think it's about, we talk about white evangelicals, white Catholics. Black evangelicals have a very different view of the world. Very different view. This is white Christian, white Catholic, and where the word white controls the phrase, the meaning of the phrase. And we saw that again. And now, underneath all of these reasons that didn't get much media coverage was we are closer in this country to a multiracial democracy, not just multi-faith, but multiracial democracy we've ever been before. And if we ever succeed, we'll be the first nation to do that. And that, to me, was underlying all of this election. A whole lot of white people who are just worried about that. And Christian nationalism, it's not about patriotism. We all love our country. It's about the win of a nation, a tribe, or a clan over other peoples. It's what you were just saying about existence, identity. There's a lot of black churches right now, pastors, who feel more isolated than they've ever felt before after this election. Isolated and rejected. And so how do we, the what next is, given all these reasons, which I think are all true, the reasons elected a result. And the result is an autocrat president who has run on racism his whole career. That's who is now president. So what do we do now when there are tribes and clans and what ethnic identities that want to win or prevent others from feeling included? That's going to be the battle now. What happens now? Reasons are wonderful. Now we have a result. There have been a lot of bad presidents who oversaw slavery and the rest, but a genuine autocrat who doesn't believe in constitutional law, in democracy, is against it, is now our president because of all the reasons. So what do we do, even religiously, in that sense? So some of us are looking at what religion did in other circumstances like this, under apartheid, in the civil rights movement, in the confessing church in the 1930s. What did religion do up against an autocratic regime that many of us feel is antithetical, in my view, to Christian values? Tony Campolo died last night, my dear friend. And Tony was a conservative evangelical. He once was accused of being a heretic. So he went to a heresy trial, and he passed as orthodox. And yet all he talked about was Jesus' first statement about being anointed to bring good news to the poor. Tony was an evangelist to the evangelicals, saying that's the good news. So how do we say now, this is the good news, What does it mean to believe, to do what we say we believe, and not just, Christian nationalism is a political takeover of sectors of religion for there being sectors. It's a sector takeover to win political power. Fundamentalism is always the use and abuse of religion for power. And that's what we've seen just happen.
Let me go to Professor Cobus-Dumais on this, because there are, in some countries, it's fairly easy for the state to align itself with religious leaders, and vice versa, because there are state religions, right? And it's very easy for state religious leaders to become enamored of, or with the leaders, and it becomes symbiotic and mutually advantageous. Money flows, privileges flow. I hope I'm not offending anybody when I point out that in Russia, for example, a state-sanctioned religion has a lot of privileges. But how did this happen in the United States? Can you just give us a little background on this whole concept of Christian nationalism and how significant a force is it really? Because we do know that there are people who are identified with Christian nationalist movements who were very much involved with January 6th, right? The January 6th mob attack on the Capitol. But can you just give us some, and just talk about how big of a phenomenon is this?
Well, first off, let me say that our Constitution is a remarkably secular document, particularly for the time in which it was written. And that's because although many of our founders were religious themselves, they also knew the dangers of religious establishment coming out of the wars of religion. And within the colonies, too, there were so many different sects, and there was religious persecution. And so they made deliberate choices to establish our country, to found our country, to allow for religious liberty, freedom to believe and freedom from coerced belief, right? Christian nationalism is something different. When I was writing Jesus and John Wayne, I looked to our eminent sociologists who have elaborate and technical and very useful definitions, but I came up with a layperson's definition. Christian nationalism essentially is the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and must be defended as such, right? And now what exactly that means, that's where it can get interesting. So it's rooted on this idea of a kind of mythical sense, that America was founded as a distinctly Christian nation. Therefore, to be American, you must be this kind of Christian, or at least support this kind of Christianity. And so it conflates Christianity with this view of politics. And then it has a sense, therefore, Christian nationalism today of loss, that we have to restore something that was lost. And when did things go bad? I mean, it kind of depends, but a lot of people point to the 1960s. Civil rights movement, feminism, anti-war movement, that's when things went really bad, although some people will put it back in the 1860s, right? And so something has to be restored. What this does is it sets up, again, a kind of us versus them. There are true Americans who support this, again, mythical notion of Christian America. That's not to say there weren't many Christians who brought their faith into the public sphere. There always have been. That's not what Christian nationalism is. It's a sense of privileging a certain type of Christians, conservative white Christians, and empowering them to lead the country, to make the laws, and to essentially determine who is or who has a right and who does not have a right.
Can I just stop and ask you, if somebody were to adhere to these beliefs, would they embrace this term? If I would say to you, you're a Christian nationalist, would they say, yes, I am? Would they say that?
Probably not. Now,
what would they say they are?
They'll probably say that they're a Bible-believing Christian.
Okay.
So actually, we
ahead,
have some new
Robert.
data on this.
But it's increasing.
Yes, it's
Robbie,
shifting
take it
on this.
away.
We asked about this, actually a joint project that PRI and Brookings did, just on this one point, and back then it was like 4 in 10 in the country had not heard of the term Christian nationalism. We asked. But among those who did, we basically found that like people who had heard of it were more likely to have negative views of it. And when we looked at how we classified people, though, even then, people who were classified as Christian nationalists actually had more positive views of the term than negative, and people who were classified as kind of rejectors of Christian nationalism had more negative views. So it actually aligned with their ideology. We asked about it again this year, and we found that number dropped. It's only 22% who have not heard of the term now. And actually now what we see is that people who are Christian nationalists actually have favorable views of the term. And we see that off the headlines today. Russell Vogt has... he's a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist.
Who is?
Russell Vogt, who may be one new nominee from
and
Trump.
without a state church,
For OMB, yeah.
without a state church,
Yeah.
we have a new constellation, the new Reformation movement, which is basically connected, but independent, charismatic, evangelical churches, and they have a plan for how to return and restore. They want to take over the 7 mountains of our society. Their plan wasn't just to win an election, it was to take over again. And so it isn't a state church, but their influence with this administration, helping elect it and now populate it and advise it, is very strong.
Can I ask you something, Reverend Wells? Because here's what I want to ask you is, You identify as evangelical. In fact, Professor Kobus-Dume, you both identify as evangelical. You know how some people say, I didn't leave the party left me. Did the party leave you? Do you feel?
Well, first of all, I'll look at myself on the very edges of evangelicalism. I come from a Reformed tradition, isolated enclave in Northwest Iowa, Dutch immigrant. So my denomination is a member of the NAE, National Association of Evangelicals. So you could put me there, but I've never self-identified. But I'll let Jim. Jim has a much longer and more fraught relationship.
I just wonder what it's like. The reason I'm asking about this because I just remember sort of the reason this is so fascinating to me is that some faith groups are, apostolic. They have leaders. You know who they are. They're either elected or appointed. Bishops. You got the whole hierarchy. But in a lot of these movements, you are called by a particular group. I guess what I'm saying, you kind of have this image. It's like herding cats, really. It's not. There's no are there meetings? People get together and decide this is what we think. But what I'm hearing you say is that there are strains within this group, and some people have been shunned, basically, because they don't. I'm just interested in what it's like, what it's been like.
Yeah, I won't cede the term evangelical like Tony Campolo didn't to the new Reformation movement or the religious right, because they have taken power by using and abusing in ways that are antithetical to what Jesus taught. I mean, they're talking about the mass deportation of the people Jesus called the stranger. The word in the Matthew 25 text means immigrant, refugee. We're talking about families that are both undocumented and documented together who will be ripped to pieces. That's what they're planning. They're setting up camps now. So going at that from the teaching of Jesus, we might say, well, if we follow what Jesus says, as good evangelicals, as Jesus followers, we might say, how do we create, in response to mass deportation, a movement of mass non-cooperation with mass deportation in the name of genuine evangelical faith? That's what Tony Campolo would have done. That's what we're going to do. So I won't cede the language to them when they're positing something that's the worship of a nation, which is idolatry biblically, a clan, a sect, a white identity. Whiteness is core to all of that. So I don't want to let them have an evangelical. I want to fight back with, I think, genuine evangelical.
But clearly this movement has purchase, right? And why do you think
Yeah,
that is?
sure.
I think it's an interesting
right.
question that Robbie and I worked on this survey. I mean, most Christians are not Christian nationalists, period. I think it's really important to emphasize that. Secondly, that there are a lot of conservatives who cannot fairly be called Christian nationalists and would not subscribe. Some of them are church-state separatist still, as they always were. So I think it's important not to, it's important to see the danger of the ideology and the fact that some people who hold it now may occupy some important positions without. I think it's important not to tar our whole community with this name. I don't think anybody here is doing that, but I think it needs to be said.
It's very interesting that some of these, for example, I've talked to several at this point, people who built very large congregations in some parts of the country who were basically kicked out of their own churches because they either criticized President-elect Trump's behavior, or who said, I don't like what he's doing, or who, you see my point, they were essentially uninvited from churches that they built. And so that's why I'm interested in
people like Pete Weiner have written, who I don't think he calls himself an evangelical anymore, but he really is an evangelical. He doesn't call himself because he's reacting to this politicization, and he's still very conservative theologically, but he's anti-Trump. And he did this long piece in The Atlantic, I think it was, about all the pastors who felt either, how do I talk to me, who were not pro-Trump, and asked, how do I talk to my congregations, or who did talk about this and found their congregations turning on them. And it's a very painful, for that wing of evangelicalism, which is not fallen in behind Trump, it's a very painful experience.
Which is feeling homeless.
I just want to remind people that we're
Yeah.
going to go to
Homeless,
questions soon-ish. So be thinking about if you'd like to join our conversation. Go ahead, E.G., you want to finish?
No, the one other thing I want to say, and this is, I think it's very important thinking about the future, which we don't know, and I agree with you. And by the way, this was not a landslide. I think it's really important for people to get that in their heads. Probably 1.5% won by when all the popular votes are counted. 233,000 votes shifted in 3 states would have shifted the result of this election. That's not a landslide out of 150 million votes. I tend to think about who might change. And when I look at, I think that you could put almost anybody on the ballot and 40% of us would vote Republican and 40% would vote Democratic. A friend of mine who was a pollster used to throw his own name in just to see what the real base vote was. I think he got 23% against Cheryl Ford or something in that poll. But it's about 40%. We're really talking about 10% of us who are going to decide the future. And it's really interesting when you think about why did this election turn out the way it did. In one of the exit polls, 8% said they didn't like Harris or Trump, and they voted about 5-3 for Trump. But that whole group is changeable. And so while we on the one hand, there's good reason to talk about what we've talked about, I think an awful lot of the voters who will change the country again are not in this group. They're a part of the base, and the base will always be there.
Or the group that sat home.
What? Or the group that stayed home. Very important, yes. Looks like there were
40%
a lot of Democrats stayed home. More Democrats stayed home.
I'm still sort of struggling with the fact that there are still, but not to overstate the case, but there are prominent black evangelicals who are part of these conservative movements. I mean, people might disagree about whether these people are sincere in their beliefs, but we're not in a position to judge that. I mean, I'm thinking about the candidate for governor in North Carolina, Mark Robinson, who identified as a strong conservative evangelical, and it emerged that he had some personal behaviors that were not in alignment, shall we say. But so do some other prominent figures. And then we see in a lot of these congregations, you see prominent black folks and Latino folks involved, and especially at a time when some of these groups are leaning heavily into kind of a white, dominionist point of view. It's confusing. So what do you think?
I think really important.
Am I right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Have you noticed this? It's interesting.
So, I mean, one really macro way of approaching this when thinking about it is that that religion in and of itself is not isolated from the influence of politics. Like this is what we're watching, what we are observing across the board here is the way in which ideology in its most extreme ways can seep into all facets of American society, and that nothing is exempt. And that's something to bear in mind, of course, moving forward. I think really importantly, and this is the way that I think about it in the way of like the erosion of democratic norms, is that there can be, these ideas have in variant ways existed earlier across American history. Like you can point to variant moments where they've come up. The really crucial thing right now is even if they are still at like the same level, even when it comes to us empirically looking by way of polling or focus groups, whatever, interviewing, just talking to folks. The erosion of norms and then sort of facilitating or like elites opting in and legitimizing these sort of actions on top of this idea that with every given election or any given moment, there is this sort of need to protect either a way of life or to go back to this sort of rosy period that may or may not exist for anyone. But the fact that it's there and that people are then able to act upon these sort of initial thoughts that they had, that's one of the sort of major differences with where we are right now versus where we once were. So what I'm basically saying is like, there's a case to be made that these attitudes, these ideas have been sort of stable out there. It's just that the guardrails that people have been talking about, NPR and other places, just like guardrails being off or there being less guardrails. I'm not attributing it to where you're at.
Professor Perry, you want to jump in on this? I mean, I'm just, what's the chicken and what's the egg? Are people Republicans because they're evangelical, or are they evangelical because they're Republicans?
Oh, okay. So that's actually it's becoming flip-flop now, because I think we have evidence in surveys and various things that we see people deciding their religious identity on the basis of their political identities. That's taking place in Pew data. We've seen that in a variety of spaces. Something I wanted to speak about this issue, but I think Kristin made a great point, that Christian nationalism, and let's just say, like, I don't call people Christian nationalists unless they call themselves that. Like, I prefer to think of it as like a spectrum that people can exist on, from like all the way to completely rejecting it, to most people in the middle, and to people who are hardcore true believers. But you've got Christian nationalism itself as an ideology is a response to threat, or the perception that you are going to lose something. And in a situation like what Andrew was talking about, where you have these kinds of identities overlapping, political, racial, and religious identities, those things can get confused. And I can think of 3 studies right now, 3 experimental studies, where groups of Christians or white Christians were told that your numbers are declining in the United States, that demographically you're being replaced, that you are, by these various groups. And they respond with greater Christian nationalism. Like, it literally increases their adherence. Yes, Christian nationalist ideology sounds like a good thing. Why? Well, because they feel like it's a circling the cultural wagons kind of mentality. It's okay, I need to double down on who this nation rightfully belongs to in this situation. And in fact, in one study that I'm thinking of, it actually caused an increase in Christian nationalism, political conservatism, and Trump support, right? And that's what Trump represents, right? He represents a promise to these groups that I will restore power to you, and that includes white, conservative, Christian, all of those things melded into one. So what I actually think, and I think this is based on trends. Obviously, like Andrew was saying, you can't like prognosticate in the future, things can change. I think what you're actually witnessing now, based on people who subscribe to this kind of ideology, is what I call a Europeanization of Christian nationalism. So in Europe, they have a version of Christian nationalism there, but it's completely denuded of any kind of religious practice. People don't care what you believe theologically or whether you go to church. This is a Christian nation, meaning it's not Muslim, meaning it's ours and not yours. We were born here and not you. In the United States, we actually see, if you see people who adhere to Christian nationalist ideology over time, they are attending church less, and they are more likely to be conservatives and Republicans over time, right? What does that mean? It means that more and more, the expectation of any kind of connection to religious practice, as we tend to think of it, is going away. And what it really comes down to is political identity.
Evangelical has become a political term for a lot of people, and a lot of very religious evangelicals are mad about that.
For people who are or not, for people on which side of it?
In other words, a lot of people who are conservative choose to identify as evangelical because whether they are practicing much or not, because they think that's the conservative term. Your question was really good. About which comes first. I've been writing about this, God help me, for more than 40 years. And I used to think that the causal arrow went from religion to politics, that people's religious views influenced their politics. For at least 10 years now, I think that causal arrow is going the other way, and that it's the politics that is influencing the religion more. And as Professor Thompson said, people are all bundled together in their identities, which is increasing not only polarization, but also hostility. And it's worth throwing in the great political scientist Alan Abramowitz has done a lot of work on this, that what we're seeing in the country is the rise of negative partisanship. Sure. If you ask people, what do you think of your own party? Their views are about the same. They like it about as much as they used to. Right. What do you think of the other party? The negatives have gone way, way up. And I think that leads, if I may use the term this way, to a lot of unchristian behavior on both sides of the aisle. I was once on a panel with my now colleague at the Post, Ramesh Ponnuru, who's a conservative Catholic. He said it really bothered him that whenever politics turned to religion, religious people got particularly nasty, which he said struck him as rather unchristian. And I appreciated it when he said it. And I think that the way in which partisanship has infiltrated religion has helped create this. And it's a real problem. But I really now think the causal arrow very clearly points that way.
I'm going to offer one complicating and maybe contradictory point here. So in our latest data, in our PRI's Christian nationalism study, we actually find that religious participation, more you go to church, the more likely you are to be Christian nationalist in our data.
Oh, wow.
It's a straight up correlation, positive correlation. The more likely you are to read the Bible, the more likely you are to be Christian nationalist in our latest study. So we're actually showing, we don't show that. It's the same thing for Trump. The more likely you are to go to church if you're white, the more likely you are to vote for Trump, right? But the Christian nationalism scores go that direction too in our most recent data.
We're going to go to questions next. Andrew has one more thought before we go to questions or comments from the audience.
So, I mean, sort of tied into this idea of the role here of sort of like social identity of one's religion, and like particularly Christian nationalism. Like there's no initial sort of telling of like historically, let's say, where this is sort of emerging. But if you recall, and there may be some folks here who are too young for this, and this may not resonate, but in a series of studies that I've conducted more recently, just on sort of like priming and activating ideas of Barack Obama, there is still a lingering sentiment. And this is going to sound like illogical when I'm bringing it up, but like folks talk about Barack Obama being a Muslim, atheist, Marxist, in like a sort of like laundry list of a variety of other things. And I think really importantly when it comes to this idea of like negative partisanship or just like outgroup, like the idea of outgroup, what we're talking about here is not only defining like who the in-group is, but particularly who they aren't, like those who aren't a part of it. And so basically the idea here is maybe we don't know who exactly those who identify as Christian nationalists are. Maybe they particularly don't know either, but they know who are not a part of the group, like really, really importantly.
And the last question I have is, again, it's the chicken and egg question. Is this leader-led, or is this a result of feelings that leaders have capitalized on?
Every nation.
You know, there's that saying, there they go and I must follow, for I am their leader.
Well, every nation has a battle between its better angels and worse demons. Every nation. And I think all this was there. Donald Trump didn't create all this. Dominionist theology goes back to the beginning, before our founding. So, but he has elevated this, and he has mobilized not just grievance, but he's mobilized those worst demons that are in there. So they're out. They're going on. And I think the big question for me theologically is religion just completely controlled or defined by politics and identity? Or is there anything about faith that can disrupt those categories and say, no, you just can't do that to kids again, separate families, because of my faith? Is there anything, if we just say religion is just conformed to politics and identity, then that's a discouraging thing for people of faith. Historically, we've also had faith disrupting that conformity and disrupting those policies in the name of values that are religious. And that's what I think may happen now even more than before. When people see the crisis we're facing now, they want to get back to what am I supposed to believe and what does that mean when this happens to marginalized people. Us and them politics rule this campaign, us and them.
Kristin, before you, and
very,
last thought before we go to the
very quickly, as a cultural historian, I want to expand just a little bit what we mean when we say religion. Religion is more than belief. It is more than theology. And religion is belonging. Religion in this country is where you get your news. It is where your source of truth comes from. It is your peer group. It is all of these things. And so when we look at how religion shapes the vote, we really have to look into, who's sending them direct mail and how did they get on that list? And where are their sources of truth and authority? Who defines truth for them? And all of this is a sense of belonging. And I think that maps on quite well also to some of the broader dynamics that folks are talking about in light of the recent election, which is information, disinformation, media ecosystems, all of those things. Religion often shapes where people are situated and where their truth is coming from.
Thoughts, other thoughts? Where are the mic folks? Okay, great. So there's a question here. And there's a question here. We'll alternate. Yeah, we'll alternate if we can. But if people are shy, and also, you know who we are. So I think I would love it if we could know who you are.
Preach, Adam.
All right. Well, first, it's good to see so many friends and partners on this amazing panel. So in 2016, part of the way that I understood and interpreted the overwhelming support, particularly among white evangelicals, but I'm glad you also mentioned that there's a majority of white Catholics and white Protestants, mainline Protestants, toward Trump, was that for many of them, maybe even the majority of them, it was kind of a Faustian bargain, that they were deeply uncomfortable with Trump's character, with his rhetoric, but they ultimately believed in and wanted a lot of the policies that he promised. Fast forward to this last election, and this kind of ties into a lot of what's been said, but also the point about sorting. I get this sense that increasingly, for a large percentage of them, particularly that would identify or would kind of qualify as white Christian nationalists, they actually voted for him because they believe they need a strong man in order to break the system, to keep themselves in power, or their worldview in power, their ideology in power. And the reason I think that's important in terms of understanding what percentage of them kind of were motivated primarily for that reason is that puts them on a very different playing field. And the role of persuasion and outreach and engagement looks very different than for those that have a whole set of other motivations. So I'm kind of curious how you see that, and then what you think we need to do about it, particularly if a very large percentage, maybe even a majority, ultimately want a strong man.
Who do you want to hear from? Okay. go
So
ahead.
I just want to speak to the first part of that, and then I'd love to hear anybody else's comments. So first, I kind of want to gently push back on the idea that evangelicals and white Catholics were actually making a Faustian bargain, or they were holding their nose and voting for Trump initially in 2016. I'm aware of Pew data that I have on my hard drive right now that's back in like January 2016, so before it was decided, before the primaries had been decided. And they were already rating Trump as like a better likely president than Ted Cruz or Ben Carson or Marco Rubio or all of those. So I actually think they've liked him for a long, long time, and that includes the church-going ones. So it's not just the like in name only evangelicals. So I actually think they have for a long, long time wanted a guy like Trump. So the strongman thing is more of a through line, in my opinion. That they wanted. So you can think of quotes by guys like Robert Jeffress, who before that election said, I don't want a pastor. I want the biggest, baddest son of a you-know-what to be the guy. In 2018,
NPR.
he said, right, so in 2018, people asked, this is one of the most famous, a Politico article asked Tony Perkins, why'd you guys give Trump a mulligan on Stormy Daniels? And he said, we were tired of getting pushed around by Obama and his leftists, and we were glad somebody was on the playground who was willing to punch the bully. They always wanted that guy, right? And that is why I think they allow him to do whatever. It's maybe you call it the Cyrus thing, maybe you call it the whatever, but it is the carte blanche. We will follow him because he fights for us. And by the way, I'll follow up this way. Like this conversation about what makes somebody religious and what is religion. It is another indicator that this is kind of downstream of our own partisan identities. We did a study last year where this was Pew data, where Pew respondents, Americans, were asked whether you think these various politicians, Trump, Harris, Biden, how religious do you think they are? The leading predictor of whether you thought one of these politicians was very religious or whatever was your party. It was like, and that included Trump. If you were a Republican, you thought Donald Trump was more religious than Mike Pence, than Joe Biden. I'm serious. That was the leading predictor that you thought. So what does that mean? It means that if this guy's on your side, if this guy represents your group and your tribe, he's religious enough, right? So I'd love to hear anybody else though respond.
Well, but the strongman thing is very concerning to me. Those reasons, they've always wanted a strongman. They have one now.
Yes, right.
That's why I said the reasons
Right.
have the result of an autocrat. Now that puts us in a different place than we've been before. We can't just say, oh, the next election will solve this. That's a mistake. We have to take the autocrat in chief seriously when a lot of people wanted that. They wanted that for all those reasons. So that means what do we respond as people of faith to that kind of strongman? Strongmen lie over and over and over because if they keep repeating the lies, they'll be believed. And we saw that again and again in this election. So strongman politics.
So Trump got 49 point something percent, call it 50%. I think 35 to 40% of those voters voted for Trump because of who he is. And I think 10 to 15% of that 50% voted for him despite who he is. There was a CBS poll that showed that 21% of Trump supporters said they didn't like him. And so there's something, going on. And, some of it was anger, some of it was protest, some of it they didn't like Kamala Harris. Maybe some reason, maybe there was some racism or misogyny going on with Kamala Harris. A whole bunch of reasons why you could dislike him and vote for him. But I think that's the give that there is. Those are people who, for example, may not support him if he indeed goes as far as some of us fear he will in criticizing the Republic. It's why I suspect if you polled on Matt Gaetz for Attorney General right now, I bet the numbers are negative. I'd be interested, but I think they would be. Sure. So I think that's the give I see in that vote.
What else? Go ahead. Where else are we going next? God, we have anybody on this side? What's going on? Come on, people on this side. And then we'll come back, we'll alternate, or do that. We'll do our best.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Smith, and I'm an assistant professor of political science here at GW. And
you join us. You should come up.
I'm talking tomorrow. So.
Oh, good.
One of the questions that I have, we've talked a little bit about race, the role of race in religion, but I'm interested in the role of racism and religion in this election. One of the things that really is striking to me about the 2024 election is that Virginia was the only former Confederate state that didn't vote for Trump, right? And it's my assumption that the South is still more religious than the North, but maybe you can correct me on that. But if that's true, how are religion and racism working together in this election? What can you say about that?
Who wants to take that?
I can jump in.
Go ahead,
So my previous book was called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. One of the things I did in that book was try to answer the question of what role does religious identity play in holding racist attitudes among white Americans. And so I set up a set of questions that were measuring, I ended up calling it the Structural Racism Index. So it was a set of 12 questions. It was everything from what do you think about Confederate monuments? What do you think about differential sentencing for black and white defendants, people convicted of crimes? What do you think about the long-tail legacy of slavery and discrimination? Those kinds of questions. And then scored people 0 to 10. So 0 was least racist on that scale. 10 was the most racist. What I basically found is that if you take your average white American and you add Christian identity, it moves them up the racism scale, not down, right? So on that scale of 0 to 10, white evangelicals we've been talking about scored 8 out of 10 on that racism scale. But white Catholics scored 7 out of 10, and white non-evangelical Protestants scored 7 out of 10. Whites who are not religious scored 4 on the scale, right? And so it tells you something about there is something about the legacy of American Christianity. I'll just give you one historical point to make this not seem so odd, right? So I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, all right? So my denomination was formed in 1845 for one purpose. That was to make enslaving other people based on the color of their skin compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the reason for our denomination being formed. By 1950, our denomination became the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country. Right? We ended up with 16 million members at our denomination's height. So when you've got kind of the largest Protestant denomination set with that moral compass in history, it becomes not so surprising.
Can I just make one other point? All systems are not the same, right? In Mississippi, right, which has by percentage the largest percentage of black voters as a percentage of the total population, there's almost no early voting. If you want to vote early, almost all voting has to take place on one day. If you want to vote early, you have to have a notarized statement saying why you want to vote early or absentee. That has to be accepted, and if it's not accepted, guess what? You don't get to vote. You see my point? All systems are not the same. So even if you have thoughts that you want to express at the ballot box, and you work on a shift where your boss says you're supposed to be under the law allowed to leave in order to vote, but what if there's minimal union membership in Mississippi to protect your rights, and your boss says you ain't going nowhere? What you gonna do? So my point here is that the ability of people to express their thoughts is not the same, you see, depending on where they live. That's the only thought I'd answer.
We did a lot of work on voter suppression during the campaign.
There's lots of questions here. Let's go.
And to your point, the North Carolina Supreme Court called the legislature's voter restrictions, new ones, as, to use their language, strategically targeted at Black Americans. So the whole system was racialized. And my view, to your point, I'm looking forward to hearing you tomorrow, racism wasn't covered properly in this election at all. So why wasn't, and it never is. So I think we've got to talk about that very deeply. It's not race, it's racism. And that undergirds the book I wrote, America's Original Sin. It's still our original sin. It's racial hierarchy. It's an assumption underneath our voting patterns.
Could I just say that the Christian church, including the white Christian church, especially the white Christian church, has been divided on race from the beginning of the Republic. Mark Knoll, the great evangelical scholar, wrote a book called God and Race in American Politics. And there were some of the strongest opponents of slavery were evangelical Christians in the North, mostly in the North, and some of the strongest supporters of slavery were evangelical Christians. But I think just a historical matter that's important to note is long before people were talking about moral majority or Christian coalition, white Southerners started shifting Republican after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They weren't voting as Christians, they were voting as white Southerners who opposed the Civil Rights Bill. And later, this was sort of reorganized under the auspices of the Christian coalition, and there were other issues those folks cared about, so I'm not writing them off in any way. But this shift among white Southerners began long before we were talking a lot about religion and politics. That's just a historical fact.
Okay, here we go.
My name is Liz DeGaynor. I'm a theology professor in Virginia, and I'm grateful for the language around race and religion and geography, and I'm wondering if we can bring gender into the room. Kristin, I'm interested in the work that you have been doing and how the desire for a strong man and the desire for heteronormative marriage and male headship is playing into what's happening and what people want, and I'm wondering what the data shows about that, please.
Hey, Liz. First, when it comes to gender, just something that's very obvious but important to keep in mind is just because women choose a candidate who is male instead of female doesn't mean gender doesn't come to play, right? And it's striking how often still in the media we'll see that kind of, well, that cancels that out because women can also be influenced by candidates' gender and want that strong man, want that protector, right? And that certainly is language that is pervasive in conservative spaces, and particularly conservative Christian spaces, right? Where your ideal of a leader is a strong man, the protector, the provider, and that women as well as men see that as the ideal of leadership. What wasn't talked about much in this election, intentionally on the part of Democrats certainly, was Kamala Harris's gender. And for strategic reasons, for understandable reasons. And at the same time, it is clear from all sorts of studies that we have done in the past. I'm not aware of any up to date, so I'll turn things over to the social scientists here in a moment. But that for not insignificant number of Americans, and certainly not with razor thin margins, or mostly thin, pretty thin margins, right, in many places, to have the first female president and then the first female president, a woman of color, would have been a remarkable shift. And there's a certain segment of the population that simply will not vote for a woman, will not vote for a woman of color. Now, part of me thinks that was already the base that was solidly in the Trump camp, but again, with small margins here, I think that we need to surface that. So I'm not sure what
Can I just have a quick question about this? Robert, do people tell the truth in these polls about this or not? I mean, if you straight up look, would you vote? Come on. I mean, do they tell the truth or not?
Not usually if you ask it straight up like that. Like, you have to get at it through experimental kind of design.
What, would you really show them like pictures, like a Rorschach test, and say, do you like pears or apples?
Yeah. Robbie is an expert at indirect ways of getting at this, and I just wrote him an email, or I thought he didn't get it actually now that I think about it, but I wrote him an email saying, I want you to do one of your experiments on the Kamala Harris vote, because Just describe what you kind of thing you can do.
And
on
Sam's
this.
done this too. Sam's done plenty of
Well,
experimental.
yeah, tell, what do you?
Why don't you go, Sam?
Tell us what.
Yeah.
Well, so you have to, I mean, you have to ask questions in indirect ways. A lot of the ways one example would be kind of the ways we get at, say, stigmatized identities or confessing to something that you feel like you might be ashamed of or embarrassed by. People do this with like identifying as an atheist or something like that, where people feel a little bit stigmatized if you identify as somebody who is just outwardly like that. And so you give them, it's difficult to explain, but you give them a list of kind of identities that they can agree to, and then you maybe take away one or add one, and it happens to be the atheist identity, and then you count up so in other words, they're able to identify with one of those identities or not, and so the one you remove, you basically are able to estimate how many people subscribe to this kind of thing in an indirect way. And you guys have done that.
They can tell you without telling you.
But
They
my basic question is, are there a significant number of people who
just
will
lying?
not vote for a woman because she's a woman? They're like, no, you can't do it.
So in straight up surveys, when you ask that question, so the General Social Survey has been asking that question for years and years, and very few people admit to saying, I will not vote for a woman. I mean, it's more of like the 10 to 15% range. And I would say that they're probably folded in. That's already probably baked into one part of that sample. I would wager that the Democratic Party probably doesn't have a high representation of those folks.
And I'll say one thing, like you can get it at proxies too. Like there's a question that actually we've borrowed at PRI from the General Social Survey. That's an agree-disagree question that says, it doesn't sound like it's going to be that relevant, but it says, do you agree or disagree the society today has become too soft and feminine?
Interesting.
Right?
Right.
And that turns out to be one of the strongest independent predictors of vote. So you score high on that question, even controlling for all kinds of stuff, gender, race, education level, region of the country, party, controlling for all that stuff. That attitude tends to be predictive of support for Trump.
Interesting.
I think really importantly here, when it comes to thinking about the inferences or the sort of like assumptions that we make about public opinion, what we're trying to do here basically is explain, 350 plus million people, but not really, but the folks that turned out, like the broad swaths of people and who turned out, and the extent to which like we can measure their sets of attitudes. I think for those who are skeptical or who haven't done this sort of thing, you'd be surprised at how remarkably honest people that participate within these sets of studies are, and particularly to this point on the sort of senses of threat or the direct opposition to Kamala Harris, her gender. A series of experiments that I've conducted over the past few months regarding people's just general sort of ideas, understandings, like motivations. There are a surprising number of open-ended responses that I have had and received of people just straight up saying they want to kill Kamala Harris. I have another series of questions, open-ended, where you just give people an open ability to describe what comes to mind when they think of the diversification of the country. One thing jumps to mind. This was back in 2022, of someone saying, "I don't agree," or I don't. I'm not saying that I agree with it, but I understand why eugenics was implemented within the past. What I'm getting at here is that when it comes to like the expression of people's deeply held personal beliefs, when it comes like mapping those and explaining, let's say, the future of an election is difficult because you need broad coverage of the mass public. But the idea here is that among the ideas that are most extreme, the extremities, people are willing and able, and many a times just do, express directly these sets of attitudes.
I would just say that judging from my mail, I agree with you.
So
I'm just going to be super honest about it. And
Yeah.
we don't often talk about the kind of communications that we receive because we don't want to encourage more of it.
Yeah.
But I will
And
let you
New
draw the
Apostolic
inference.
Reformation leaders this time said things like, well, let's be clear, I have nothing against black women, but.
But why do they
And
want
the
to kill her?
bibli-
Why do
but-
they want to kill her?
Well,
What
the
is that
biblical image they put forward for her was Jezebel.
yeah.
They put she as Kamala Harris is Jezebel, this loathsome biblical figure. So that's underneath the hostility and hate. They made her into Jezebel and called her that. So So Cyrus and Jezebel were factors in this election.
Well, Jehu, right? So Adam
Jehu,
mentioned
right.
King Cyrus. That was all 2016. 2020, in the charismatic spaces, they were saying Trump is our King Jehu. That was the new prophecy. And if you don't know who Jehu was, you got to go back to your Bibles and read the story of Jehu killing Jezebel, having her thrown from a window, trampling her with his horses, and the dogs ate her body. And then he wasn't done. Then he went to, in modern parlance, drain the swamp, and to slaughter all members of Ahab and Jezebel's family and all religious leaders who were loyal to them and persecuted God's people. That was the model put forward before the 2024 election.
Some call that retribution.
Exactly.
Really importantly here, when it comes to thinking about the most extreme ideas, attitudes, I think that the way in which it ought to be thought of is one bucket of a subset of Americans who are out there. We are not, as mentioned, attributing this across the board, but the other major thing, and Jasmine, hi, we used to work together. I left. I wasn't forced. It was by my own volition. The really important thing when it comes to thinking about the role of racism and sexism here is a lot less about the motivators and the way in which it would push people in a particular direction. Conversely, when thinking about the various direct uses of messaging along the lines of the Trump campaign and endorsed by the Trump campaign, the idea to think about this is much more in the unobservable way or in the converse way, in such a way where it's to say, this did not convince people otherwise to not vote for this individual. And because of this idea that if in fact this is antithetical in any capacity to their own worldviews, their senses, it did not push them in the opposite
Sure, I'm
direction.
thinking about a columnist for the Post. He's also a columnist for the USA Today now. His name is Stephen Petro. He used to write a column for the Post called Civilities. He identifies as LGBT, and he wrote a lot of his work was about people understanding each other. He lives in the South, and about people civilities, just as he said. And what he wrote about when Trump was first elected was, he said, I'm not saying that everybody who voted for him is a racist, but what I am saying is his racism didn't bother you.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, one more, I think we have time for one more. Shall we have one more before we go to our closing thoughts here? Because we have to, whoever's in charge here? Okay.
I just have to say, what is the future of the progressive evangelicals, since we've talked about racists and those of us who happen to be otherwise? I was once told by a Buddhist by the name of Bob Doppelt at the University of Oregon that on climate change and other issues, he said, if people are persuaded by 2 to 1 that it's in their interest to change, they will change. And I happen to think that faith. Now, Adam comes from a different spectrum of this, but I come from the conservative evangelical world, and I became progressive. And I flipped. I changed. It took, a few years. Influence of people like Jim Wild, and a few others. But I changed. And I happen to think there's a huge community out of this country. I mean, huge community of people who have, habits of the heart, who are very different than what the right wing is saying and doing. And I'll betcha, give it 4 years, and we'll see a total change.
So I'm going to ask.
I don't know.
Robert,
You can say I'm all washed up, but that's all right. Most
and then
people do anyway.
I want to get a brief answer from somebody, and then I want to get some brief closing thoughts.
Rick is an amazing person who led the National Association of Evangelicals to take climate change seriously and put out an extraordinary statement on our obligations to creation. So thank you, Rich. Yeah. I think there is a significant community of religious people, including a lot of Christians, who fall into that category. But what I said earlier that I think puts more progressive Christians in a bit of a disadvantage now is this the departure of so many younger people who may have been cradle in their, may have been born in those congregations, who have left because they react to a politics that they associate with Christianity. And I've always told people that people like you are better at converting people to Christianity, because all those folks can listen to people like you and say, there is a logic in the Gospels that is about protecting creation, standing up for the poor, welcoming the stranger, and it's just not a gospel that gets in the papers as much. It's what Jim has been preaching all his life. So I think he said, I think it's there, but I think it's very complicated now because of how many people have left the Christian church.
So we're gonna leave it there for now. I'm gonna ask each of you to give us a closing thought as briefly as you can. And I'm just gonna ask you, what would you like us to be thinking about going forward? And do you wanna start? I'm gonna start this way and go this way. How's that?
All right, I'm up. So I'm going to start. I wrote a piece at Time last week called "What White Christians Have Wrought," and I think is where I'm going to leave it, because we get my day job. I get paid to kind of look at, slice and dice the data, see who's moved, who's up, who's down, all this stuff. And to me, the biggest thing that sort of like weighed on me is that, to your point, like this was the most racist campaign we have seen since George Wallace in 1968, in my opinion, and it did not move white Christians 1 centimeter. It didn't move white evangelicals. It didn't really move white non-evangelicals, as far as we could tell. It didn't move white Catholics. Like, they're still there. And so if you put all them together, like, it's still 2/3, like 2-to-1 white Christians voted for Trump, right? With this xenophobic, racist, overtly racist campaign. And if we're thinking about the future and the future of a pluralistic democracy, we're going to have more than 1 in 3 white Christians on board with that project.
Robert P. Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
I looked over my shoulder and saw George Washington there. And what came to me, and I looked it up on my phone to get it right, was his letter to Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And people quote this all the time, but I think this is a particularly good time to quote this as to what we aspire to. And bear in mind, he says in here, he gives to bigotry no sanction. Yes, he was a slave owner. He's talking here about religious bigotry, but on religious bigotry, he had it right. He said he looked forward to a time when everyone shall sit safely under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. That's from the Old Testament. And he continues, for happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they live under its protection, should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Gives persecution no assistance. The words we should think about in the next 4 years.
E.J. Dionne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I live in Oklahoma, and we've become a laboratory for, I think, Christian nationalist public policy, especially with regard to public education. But one of the things that gives me hope right now is the pushback at the local level that we've actually seen against the people trying to do this. So we have Ryan Walters, who is our state superintendent of public instruction, who's made a national name for himself and was trying to be the Secretary of Education. Didn't get picked for it, thankfully. I think the next 4 years are going to be pretty lousy at the federal level. Let's just go ahead and say that. Like, I think it's going to be a basket of corruption from every angle. But what we've actually seen in Oklahoma that's, I think, giving me hope right now is the extent to which local communities, when they get organized and you put leadership in place that actually have integrity that you appreciate, they can resist and they can push. They can either disregard it, or like you have enough autonomy at the local level to disregard it or to push back or to do something else. And so I think now that the national election is over, I actually think we really ought to give our attention to local level, community level, things that you can do in public schools, things you can do in your own city, things that you can do in your own town, so that you can make sure that you have the capacity to be able to resist those kinds of things that may be taking place at the federal level. That includes religious persecution, that includes racist policy, that includes gutting public education, all those kinds of things. And so my thought that I would leave with you, and this is what we're going to be doing in Oklahoma wherever I can, is to try to lean into the capacity of local communities to resist whatever garbage is going to come down at the federal level for the next 4 years.
Samuel Perry, thank you.
That was fantastic. Tough to follow. I think really importantly, we've been harping on this point about the future, and I think although we can make sort of declarations about what we expect, not only on sort of local levels can folks involve themselves, engage themselves, and sort of either build community or sort of robust democratic norms and institutions. But also really importantly, like we're not on any sort of set path in any direction at this point. And like uncertainty into the future, unfortunately, breeds a lot of senses of anxiety and threat and fear. But like we exist in a sort of like we're socially embedded individuals. And what I mean by that is that anything and everything that you do has a bearing on this world. We are not on any particular sort of fatalistic path into either destruction or anything of the sort that is, that we can envision or not envision. And so I think that this idea of at least engaging not only with the uncertainty, but this sort of idea that both in the way of like observing and being honest with ourselves about what we may be perceiving as erosion of democracy into the future, and not sort of either digging our heads in the sand or reminding ourselves or telling others that this is something that is normal, is a proper thing to engage in, because that can further that same sort of democratic erosion. But also in terms of the ways in which that we grapple with those things, that not only has a bearing, but it has a staying power, is what I'm basically saying. So each and every one of us has a power.
Andrew Thompson, thank you so much. Jamal.
Amen.
Amen to that. Strongmen, autocrats don't just fix inflation. They attack. They attack for their own power. Yeah. We're going to see more and more of that. Every movement has to learn, I call it the dance, the outside and the inside. So the rights movement worked inside and got that law passed that ended the white Christian South, but also they worked the outside. King had a base on the outside that made his work on the inside work. So how can we appeal to some of the values that we think are religious? In my class yesterday, we kind of broke down the election with black churches, Hispanic, Asian American, and then I asked them, how about the nuns? How about all of you? What did you think? And I didn't hear them saying, we're now going to reject religion altogether. That was my fear. Rather, it was, we need a different kind of faith, a different kind of religion. Where do I find that? Which is a very different response. So Adam and I are working on this retreat for faith leaders in January. And I'm coming down to, we need to call people to defend the vulnerable. That's in all our religious traditions. Defend the vulnerable across boundaries. Defend the truth, as you're saying, because truth will be destroyed if they have their way. Defend democracy. And then fight racism and find courage. So those principles, I think, could appeal, EJ, to those people who are trying to sort things out with not asking how they voted, but here's some values we're calling you to. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And it won't be solved, as some of our McCord faculty feel, by just another election. It's deeper than that. So why don't we go deeper too and call for those things? That's what I would say.
Jim Wallace, thank you. Kristin Covist, you may finish us up.
Oh, such pressure, because I'm not known for being an inspirational speaker.
Yes, you are.
A couple quick points. First, in terms of Christian nationalism, yes, it will be deeply embedded in all likelihood in the next administration, as we're seeing these appointments kind of come online. Both representation likely from Project 2025, America First, and so on. But certain things may limit the power of Christian nationalists in the next administration. I mean, Trump himself can be a wild card. He feels beholden to no particular demographic at this point with his mandate. And then there are also folks like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. So the extent to which Christian nationalism will thrive will probably depend on the extent to which it aligns with other agendas as well. One point that I'll leave you with, which is a bit of a downer perhaps, is one of the things that I have my eye on is a promise that Trump made on his campaign multiple times when he was speaking before Christian audiences, particularly evangelical audiences, and that was to establish an anti-Christian bias task force. And that raises some red flags for me. And particularly having observed these spaces closely, I can imagine that some of the targets of alleged anti-Christian bias will be Christians themselves who are drawing on their faith tradition to counter this Christian nationalist agenda. And so, I think it will be very important to speak clearly and loudly and to reclaim terms like religious liberty, which have been held captive or captivated by the right to argue for Christian supremacy and lean into our basic constitutional rights.
Kristin Kobus-Dumais, thank you.
That was
so much.
inspirational.
And thank you
I'm
all so
inspired.
much for being here today, and lots more to talk about. Those of you who are participating in the conference tomorrow, I'm sure you'll have a lot to discuss. Thank you all so much for coming.